Hey, good morning. Welcome to Kevin Stoda on the porch. And I hope you're having a great day. Um, I would like to share this morning about leadership and the roles of women by looking at a National Geographic article here. Uh, it's, it doesn't show it in reverse, but it says taking the lead. And the subtitle is Women in Bolivia, New Zealand, Iraq, and Afghanistan have made huge gains in achieving political power, but many still face cultural resistance and even violence as their influence increases. Um, the article shows a series of great photos. Here's a leader in Afghanistan, a young woman leader who helps with the environment, but here's the information by the picture. It says here, Latifa Mushina, 35, is the deputy governor of Bamiyan province. Women now hold the position in 5 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces. Here, Mushini, who pledges to protect her province's environment, enjoys her weekly hike in Bandi Amir, Afghanistan's first national park, with her husband by her side and their friend. Other people who are subject to this story include this mayor from Bolivia, okay, who hasn't had it so good, but story goes. Shortly after she was elected in 2015 as the first woman mayor of El Alto, Soledad Capitan Tankara received threats, and an arson attack on her office killed 6 people. Chapaton, who campaigned against graft and cronyism, is proud to have achieved a lot despite a few economic resources. Here, she was surrounded by supporters and draped in elaborate garlands given to her. She attends a dedication ceremony. Okay, that's the dedication ceremony. And the other picture is related to these women. They're all from New Zealand. And the subtitle, the words under the picture are Bronwyn Clifford, 16, stands with other Maori women on Waitangi Day, observed each February to commemorate the Treaty of Waitangi, signed by some 500 Maori chiefs and the British in 1840. Much ancestral land was lost during Britain's 19th century colonization. Today, Maori women use social media to mobilize support for indigenous land rights and other reforms. This topic is pretty important. We're talking a lot these days about racial justice, but we need to talk about women's justice globally and their access to power. There's a picture of a woman with shortened hair in this shadowy picture in the back. It says here, the Bolivian mayor thought she was going to die. It was November 6th, 2019, and the municipal building was on fire, set ablaze after a disputed October presidential election and protest that ousted socialist President Evo Morales. Mayor Maria Patricia Arce Guzman, 48, a member of Morales' party, the movement toward socialism, escaped the smoke and tried to dodge the hostile crowd outside. As you notice, the last autumn there was a terrible coup in Colombia that whereby a military force took over the government and then handed the power to another woman leader. But usually Bolivia's history has been very much anti-women. Hobbled by a bad knee, she ran through the streets of Vinto, a town in the central Bolivian department of Cochabamba, where she'd been mayor since June 2015. She lost her shoes but didn't stop. Then they grabbed me and started shouting that I was a murderer, Arce later told me, and her hours-long ordeal began. Rioters doused her in gasoline. She also smelled of urine and bleach, kicked, beaten with sticks, and pelted with stones. The mayor was dragged barefoot to a site where a 20-year-old Limberth Guzman Vasquez had died in a clash between left-wing supporters of the ousted president and the right-wing opponents some days earlier. The anti-Morales protesters accused Arce of financing and supporting leftists involved in the violence that claimed the young man. I thought they were going to kill me, set me on fire, Arce says. A man poured red paint over a woman, cut off Arce's waist-length, honey-colored hair. It felt like she was almost tearing my scalp. Some in the crowd shouted that they would kill her two sons. Others told her to resign and to denounce her former President Morales, who had been declared the winner of the election amid allegations of fraud. After losing support from the military and police, Morales had resigned and had to flee the country. Videos circulated on social media of a distressed but defiant Arce surrounded by masked protesters. I'm not going to shut up, she said in one snippet, and if they want to kill me, let them kill me. Finally, people she didn't know spirited her away on a motorbike and handed her to the police for protection. The assault on Arce reflected the depth of bitter divisions in Bolivian politics, but it also shed light on the contradiction. Bolivia is known for promoting representation by women in its national and local governments. And it's one of the most dangerous places in South America to be a woman. The country has the highest rate of femicide, women killed because of their gender, on the continent. 2.3 murders for every 100,000 women in 2018. In 2019, 117 women were killed. It's estimated that 70% of Bolivian women have been sexually or physically abused. Here's a picture of where women come in on Mondays and report the abuses that they've had during the week. It's documented here according to the picture. Most of the files teetering on the back shelves at the medical examiner's office in El Alto are for recent domestic abuse cases. Women report incidents at the office lining up outside on Monday mornings after their partners have returned to work. And here are women protesting for their rights down at the bottom of the page. Family members of femicide victims, women killed because of their gender, protest before the presidential palace in La Paz on January 2020. On this day, interim President Jeanine Áñez Chavez called for modifying a law that aggressors in cases of violence against women. So they have put a woman in charge of the country, but we have to really pray that they get this new law through. The most dangerous places in South America to be a woman is Bolivia, as I said. When Arce was assaulted, there were 3 other women mayors in Cochabamba, also members of Morales' party. Only Arce was targeted physically. She suspects because she's involved in the female empowerment programs, skills-based employment training such as basket weaving and cooking classes aimed at promoting financial independence for women. The programs weren't popular with some men, she says. Arce's detractors accuse her of improperly using public resources to incite violence, which she denies. There's a lot of machismo here, Arce says. I think they want to teach me a lesson and make me an example to others. Arce returned to her office in Cochabamba weeks after she was attacked to finish a term that would end on May 30th, 2020. On a warm December morning, she sat at her desk, her natural dark brown hair growing back slightly longer than a buzz cut. The fear is always there, she told me. I don't feel protected here. The glasses windows in her office, smashed in the riot, were still covered in plastic sheets that billowed gently. Images of Morales adorned the walls. There were no photos of Morales' more conservative successor, Jeanine Áñez Chavez, a woman Arce does not support. We women have struggled to have a political space, and we can't give it up, Arce said through tears, referring to her mayoral post. If I quit and let them win, what message does that send to people? To the women I tell to keep going. Throughout history and around the world, women who sought political power often faced resistance ranging from slurs to assassination. Women have made significant gains but continued to face familiar barriers, including in countries countries that have given women a greater voice in governing. In more than half the world's countries, including Bolivia and conflict-riddled states such as Afghanistan and Iraq, legislative gender quotas now guarantee the formal political participation of women. Such quotas have their limitations, however. They've been criticized as undemocratic and discriminatory by some in liberal democracies who argue that they undermine the principle of merit by favoring women over men solely based on gender. And as in Bolivia, they don't prevent criticism of women officials from occasionally taking a nasty sexist tone. There are also historical structural inequalities embedded in gender-neutral, merit-based political systems. Oh, I want to shout out to Rahim Bacha. Hi, Rahim. I'm enjoying my being able to share from one of my favorite magazines, National Geographic, and we're talking about women today, Rahim. God bless you, Rahim. Let me continue, and I'll turn the page. Okay, here's a place in the countryside in Bolivia. And the picture says, Judith Yolanda Quintana Vega prays with her sister Estela, where the body of her daughter Abigail Quintana, 18, was found. The sisters have formed a group to advocate for justice on behalf of victims of femicide. Okay, all over the country in Bolivia. That's the case. Let me give a shout out to Rahim again. Out to Rahim and his all right. Some other pictures here. I think this is from New Zealand. And the picture shows Maori wardens who Hana Tukaki, Wiki Todd, and Marianne Vogt enjoy a moment at the 2020 Waitangi Day. Some 900 volunteer wardens help ensure the health and safety of indigenous communities. And there's another picture here. I think she's the president of New Zealand. No, this is another woman. This is Women's Empowerment. She's only 28 years old. This woman with her child is Kiritapu Alan, a member of the parliament in New Zealand. She attends the Mataatua Kapahaka, a performing arts competition with her daughter. He Waitarangi Alan Coates. Alan says her priority is advocating for those in remote and rural communities and others who often do not have a voice. People in the United States claim that if we were to have quotas, they'd favor dominant groups of society, including men, white people, and those with significant financial resources. Overcoming barriers to political entry is one challenge. What women can and can't do once in power is another thing. The inclusion of women in a party or parliament may tick the box for gender equality, but it also can be tokenism if female politicians are seen but less often heard. And then there are questions of which women gain access to the halls of power and how representative they are of others, questions that several countries such as New Zealand and Afghanistan are grappling with. Despite intimidation, violence, and other barriers, women around the world are holding their ground in an effort to seize and strengthen their political power. Some governments have made significant advances in female participation in politics without mandating quotas. For example, New Zealand, the first country in the world to grant women the right to vote in 1893, ranks 20th in the world when it comes to women's inclusion in parliament. The United States, by comparison, sits at number 81. So in other words, women's participation in Congress and government, we're sitting in the world at 81. America, we got to do better. According to the International Parliamentary Union, a Swiss-based global organization of parliaments. But getting in is only part of the challenge. In some countries, the presence of women in decision-making roles doesn't necessarily translate into greater equality for that country's women. For some women, such as Iraqi parliamentarians, being in power doesn't always mean having power. Iraq was once at the forefront of women's rights in the Middle East. The country's 1959 personal status law restricted polygamy and child marriage, outlawed forced marriages, and improved women's rights in divorce, child custody, and inheritance. The 1970 Constitution, drafted by Saddam Hussein's Security Ba'ath Party, enshrined equal rights for all citizens. Women's literacy rates, education, and participation in the workforce were all actively promoted through generous policies, such as free childcare and 6 months of paid maternity leave. That momentum, however, was reversed by international sanctions and decades of successive wars. Hussein was brutal, murderous dictator, but his fall in 2003 paved the way for the rise of conservative religious clerics and parliamentarians who have sought to chip away at women's rights. The religious political parties really don't believe in women participation in high positions, says Hannah Edouard, who's been working on human rights for more than 50 years in that country. The post 2003 Iraqi constitution decrees that a quarter of the nation's parliamentary seats are to be reserved for women. But as women everywhere know, being in the room doesn't necessarily mean being heard. Noura al-Bajri, a female parliamentarian from Mosul, first elected in 2010, says that the religious parties and blocs that dominate parliament consider women are simply there to make up the numbers and not to have an actual role in major decision making. There are no women in Iraq's cabinet or other high level roles, and al Bajri says that Iraq's female parliamentarians are not allies. I must be honest, we women don't support each other or ourselves. There's an element of jealousy, selfishness, and competition. If Iraq's 84 female lawmakers banded together, they'd form a significant bloc in parliament. But in the 329 seat parliamentary parliament, Edward says, until 2018, attempts to form a caucus had failed. Edward is co-founder of several groups, including Al Amal Associates and Iraqi Women's Network, an umbrella group encompassing more than 90 women's organizations in Iraq. Edward is trying to change attitudes in parliament through workshops for male and female lawmakers focused on political empowerment and women's issues. We are not making confrontations. We try to make a channel of cooperation, even with the ones who are against the points we raise, she says. And she is seeing results. Some of them were religious people. They changed their ideas, she adds. But the problem isn't just creating change. It's the high voices of those opposed to change. They are a very small group, but they are very aggressive, and they try to drown the voices of others out. And that's what's been happening in the United States, too, the minority rule, for the last many decades. And she is seeing results. But she's talking about people such as the conservative parliamentarians who in 2014 backed a bill known as the Job-Free Law, including among its 254 articles was a provision to legalize marriage for girls as young as 9 years old, while another stated that a husband was not required to financially support his wife if she was either too young or too old to satisfy him sexually. Women's rights activists were the driving force of opposition to the bill and succeeded in removing it from the parliamentary agenda, as well as defeating a subsequent attempt, most recently in 2017, to reintroduce similar legislation. We raised public opinion against it, Edouard says. I was so happy to see that not only our voices, but the voices of public opinion in Iraq were raised very strongly against this. That was the happiest moment of my life, she says. Over here is a picture of the Prime Minister in New Zealand speaking before her parliament. I noticed that there's hardly any women in there, only her in the front row. Um, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern speaks to the New Zealand Parliament in February amid the COVID-19 crisis in March. She was decisive in announcing a strict lockdown for the nation. I have a very keen sense of the magnitude of this moment, she says. Kiwis, go home, be strong, and be kind. She was very highly ranked uh, in the world for her decisions on the COVID-19. We pray that things stay good in um, New Zealand for them and the Maoris. Um, Now I'm going to go on to Afghanistan's women. Afghanistan's women, like Iraq's, have faced decades of war, foreign military interventions, the rise and fall and rise again of hardline Islamists such as Taliban, and worsening political instability and insecurity. But unlike Iraq's female parliamentarians, who were late to form a women's assembly, some in Afghanistan established a women's caucus more than a decade ago. It shows what women can do working together sometimes. 27% or 68 of the 249 seats in Afghanistan's lower house are reserved for women. So if you have seats reserved for you women, you need to take advantage of it. Shinko Karakaya was first elected to Parliament in 2005 to represent the capital of Kabul. She was instrumental in assembling the female caucus, spurred by a draft bill known as the uh, Shiite Personal Status Law. It was similar to the Jaffrey bill in Iraq, and both bills were based on the same jurisprudence. It was terrible stuff, Karakaya says of the bill's articles. The problem was that the main decision makers in the society are men, not women. Even if we become politicians, the first and last word is said by a man, says Karakale, who received a death threat for arguing against the bill. I was under a lot of pressure. I limited my movements and had guards look after me. It was a terrible time. Female parliamentarians make up only 24 of the 150 or so members of the Women's Parliamentary Caucus, which includes women from civil society, the judiciary, and media. The most important thing was that we stuck together and said, what's our priority? Karakyle says, if you are in the parliament and you came via a reserved seat, the quota system that comes with obligations, and we have to fulfill them, we have to work for the women of Afghanistan. Amendments were made to the bill, and despite continued protest by women's activists, it was signed into law in 2009, the same year as the Elimination of Violence Against Women law championed by the caucus. Afghanistan's women now face a new yet familiar challenge: the return of the Taliban. In 2001, the Taliban government was ousted in a U.S. invasion following 9/11 as a punishment for the group's harboring of al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. In February 2020, the United States signed a peace deal with the Taliban aimed at ending the 18-year war. It's unclear how much influence the Taliban still holds inside the war-torn country and how it intends to wield its power after U.S. troops withdraw. I don't know yet really what the Taliban wants us to lose and to sacrifice, Kale says, noting that the Afghan women weren't involved in the U.S. Taliban peace talks. Women were always the losers of the war, and we don't want to be the losers in the peace agreement. That's our concern. We are not against peace. We are not against bringing the Taliban back to politics in Afghanistan to at last end this long war. But the women of today are not the women of yesterday. Women, she says, deserve seats at the negotiating table. Yeah, it was shameless that the U.S. didn't require that. Jamila Afghani, a prominent women's rights activist and Islamic scholar, was one of the few women granted an audience with the Taliban during the negotiations. She was among the delegations of women to meet with the Taliban officials in Qatar. The 11 women were part of a larger group of Afghan civil. Unfortunately, during the formal meetings, there was no opportunity to talk about women's rights. But we did raise the issue during tea breaks, lunch breaks with them. Afghani came away from the two-day meeting concerned. The Taliban said that they will agree with the Sharia-given rights and regulations for women, or more precisely, their interpretation of such rights. which Afghani considers totally unacceptable and un-Islamic because of the limits placed on women. We cannot go back to what it was like before under the Taliban rule, she says. They were banning women from going to school and work. We cannot tolerate that. Since the Taliban was ousted from government in 2001, Afghani has worked to empower women through Islam, educating some 6,000 moms across the country about women's rights through her Noor Educational and Capacity Development Organization. She also has provided literacy and religious education to about 50,000 girls and women. She says she has been active in many other ways too. Let me show you a scene that's in the National Geographic here. Okay. See these girls in school? These are high school seniors in today's Afghanistan. And that's a board, of course. And the women look very strong. It's a girls' school. It says end of term exams over at Kabul's Zargona High School, one of the country's largest girls' schools with more than 8,500 students and 230 teachers. We are scared, Principal Nasreen Nurzai says, concerned the Taliban could regain power and deny education to girls. In many ways, Afghan women have been left out. Women parliamentarians and other officials in the country are continually threatened. Kurkle says that Afghani and her ideas don't represent her. Afghani has a different mentality than most Afghan women, Kurkle says, adding that while it was important to have women at peace talks with the Taliban, which women are you talking about? You can't have a few political elites and say there are women represented. Yeah, that's a good question about power. If you have some seats at the table, are they the right people who have the seats? Do they represent a great variety of people? Afghanis heard such criticism before. Sometimes I feel like, where should I go? Civil society is moderate. Civil society thinks I'm conservative or I'm Islamist. And some of the Islamist people say I'm introducing new Islam. I cannot represent everybody all the time, but I'm sure that I can represent a large number of women who believe in Islamic values. Okay. Here's some other people that are referred to in the article. Okay. Parliamentary Miriam Samat is 28 years old and a member of the Women's Caucus. She is leaving Parliament on December 9th, 2019, the day that the body narrowly passed a law protecting child rights. We are the women who grew up after the war. We are the new generation. We have demands, she said. So, only 28 years old. So I encourage is Sarif there? It's risky. She was attacked. This idea of power and participation is a question that even peaceful, historical, progressive Western democracies such as New Zealand's have grappled with. Which women are being heard from? From what communities are they, and for whom are they speaking? New Zealand's current leader, 39-year-old Jacinda Ardern, is the country's third female prime minister, after Jennifer Shipley blazed the path in 1997, followed by Helen Clark 2 years later. New Zealand has never elected a prime minister, male or female, from its indigenous Maori population, which makes up about 16.5% of the population in New Zealand. There have been Maori members of parliament since 1868, after the Maori Representative Act of 1867 designated 4 elected Maori seats in the 120-member House of Representatives, which includes 71 seats and 49 appointed by parties. Now, more than 150 years later, there are 29 Maori in the House, 11 of women. However, New Zealand's Maori security right by ending claims by Maori for breaches of the treaty was declared null in 1877 by Sir. New Zealand's Chief Justice. He said that, I'll say that was 18 savages who were not capable of signing a treaty. It wasn't legally re-recognized again until the 70s, 100 years later. Before creation, Maori women shared an equal but complementary power with men, says Margaret Mutu, professor of Maori at the University of Auckland, the chair of her indigenous parliament, and tribal leader of her Ngati. Women, she says, were responsible for the spiritual well-being of their people while men dealt with the physical world. So even in their roles in Maori times, women's power was divided to certain spheres and men's to others. In terms of decision making and the exercising of power, women were an essential part of the system. Adding that the Western patriarchal traditions of the colonizers, specifically Christianity, did huge damage to that system. In the late 1800s, Maori women, most notably Mary Te Tai Magakia, campaigned for women's suffrage and the right to stand for parliament. Maori women never assumed that they had no role or had no voice, as white women assumed it at the time, Mutu says. In many ways, Maori culture has been mainstreamed, although assimilation can also be a form of colonization. Maori greetings such as kia ora are widely used by non-Maori, and schoolboys are taught how to perform the haka war dance. Despite the semblance of integration, communal relations, some Maori and non-Maori, are fraught, with pending land grants disputes continuing and allegations that the state has been biased against Maori women overall. Kiritapu Allen, a woman whose picture I showed you earlier, was appointed by her Labour Party and is one of the 29 Maori in the 120-seat House. She remembers hitchhiking to Wellington at age 17 on the way to catch a ferry to the cherry picking fields. Allen recalls looking at the Parliament building known as Beehive and wondering about the disconnect. From those halls or chambers of power, she says, how do these people here represent me, and do they understand people like us? Yeah, that's a question everybody should ask to their government. When they look at the seats of power, how do these people here represent me? And do they understand people like us? I'll say that again because it's an important question. Everybody should look at the government and say, how do these people there represent me? And do they understand people like us? Allen went back to school to study law and politics. She joined Ardern's Labour Party while in college and interned in the office of the then Prime Minister Helen Clark. As a young Maori woman from a modest blue-collar background and a married mother in a same-sex relationship, Allen says she made it to Parliament in 2017 with a lot of luck and hard work, and not because of any structural ladders that helped her rise. Whether you're young and indigenous, young and ethnic, young and a woman, if you live a non-privileged existence, Allen says, there are significant challenges that you have to overcome. What kind of challenges do you have to overcome? Well, New Zealand has a voluntary party quota system. In 2013, the Labour Party became the first to introduce a gender quota system to ensure that half of its parliament would be women. So the party decided that its representation should be about half women. In 2015, the Green Party announced that half of its cabinet ministers would be women. I don't know how that would work in countries like the United States with winner take all elections. But certainly, you could appoint half the ministers in the government opposed to for women, like they did in New Zealand. In some cases, Prime Minister Ardern made headlines for being an unmarried pregnant woman leading the country. When Allen brought her 4-month-old baby into Parliament, she says it invoked a lot of vitriolic opposition. How dare a mother be in the Parliament parenting a child, she recalls. If we want to encourage more and more women into not just the workforce, but positions of power and leadership, well, women need to take leadership on the way it really looks. In her moving maiden speech to the House in 2017, draped in her family's heirloom Kauai cloak of kiwi feathers, Allen recounted how her grandmother and her namesake was punished at school for speaking her native language and how her name was changed from Kiritapu to Kitty. My Nana's cultural identity was whipped out of her at that school, and so too, some might say, was her voice. So, Nana, I stand here in this house to honor your name, to give voice to the voiceless who, for whatever their circumstances, cannot speak for themselves. Um, Allen said this in her speech. It is a powerful legacy that Allen considers a key part of her mission. Issues around the law, human rights, public authority, and impact on indigenous communities inspired Allen's bid to become a lawyer and then a politician. It triggered my career to really understand the law and its application and how the law could be used as a tool not only for oppression, but how it could be a tool of liberation or at least restrict oppression. Yeah, that's what Americans really need to think about. How can you do this? How can the law be used as a tool not only for oppression, but how can it be a tool of liberation or a, a way to restrict oppression? There's only so much the law can do. There are limits to legislative reform, especially if societal attitudes don't change or the implementation of existing laws are lax. On paper, Bolivia's 2009 constitution guarantee is equal rights for women. Legislation such as 2013 laws 348 criminalizes violence against women and imposes a penalty for femicide of 30 years in prison without parole, but conviction rates are dismal. Less than 4% of femicide cases result in a sentencing. In April 2019, Shirley Franco, I'll say that again, less than 4% of the femicide cases in Bolivia result in sentencing. So 96% are getting off scot-free. Something's wrong with the legal system. You need to change it, and you need to pay for enforcement. And enforcement might be better police who are more sympathetic to women, courts that are more sympathetic to women, and a political environment that is really supportive of women. Violence against women in politics is so pervasive that in 2012, Bolivia pioneered a law to combat it. Law 33 criminalizes acts including spreading false information about female politicians to discredit them, or, as in the case of Mayor Arce, pressuring a woman to resign from an elected position and physically attacking her. The mayor has filed a formal complaint, but she doesn't know if she'll get justice. In 2019, the Bolivian Association of Council Women, an NGO that brings together counselors from across the nations, including mayors, to defend the political rights of women, received 127 complaints of various forms of harassment and intimidation of female leaders in the country. In 2018, there were 117 complaints. The year before, 64. So apparently, they're either increasing or women are feeling more comfortable in coming forward. Bernarda Sarue Pereira is the executive director of the organization. She suspects that the real numbers are much higher, but that fears keep women from reporting abuse. When someone makes a formal complaint, their persecution often doubles. Their harassment doubles. They are bothered more and stigmatized more, she says. There are only 33 female mayors in Bolivia's 339 municipalities, 11 of whom have filed complaints. So 11 of 33 mayors have filed complaints. The Bolivian women who have been targeted serve at all levels of power, including the parliament, and they are from across the political spectrum. The harassment is not restricted to a geographic location or women of a particular ethnicity in a country where some 48% of the population is of indigenous origin. It's just women who exercise political power, Pereira says, adding that existing laws don't work because they're not implemented effectively. It takes a lot of effort for justice to be done in our country. Some mayors, such as Bertha Elian Quispe Tito, have been prevented from entering their workplaces, been physically attacked, and had their families threatened. Quispe was 27 in 2015 when she became the first female mayor of Collana, a small rural town of some 5,000 people. of her Aymara indigenous group. A Mas party member, she says her problem started when she moved to regulate the local limestone mining industry. She was beaten by masked men one night in September 2016 after she left the office. It wasn't a random attack or robbery. They warned me that if I didn't resign, my sisters were going to pay all the consequences. Family, she says, they said things like, if I don't quit, they'd burn my father's house, take the cattle. Four of her colleagues in the council were kidnapped to pressure Kispi to withdraw her complaint about the attack. She did, and the four were released, but no one was prosecuted for kidnapping. The doors of the municipal building where she worked were welded shut and walled up with bricks, forcing her to relocate to another town for her own safety. She's not certain that she'll run for re-election. The Aymara mayor, El Alto Soledad Chapaton Tankara, 39-year-old, is from the other side of the political spectrum. A member of the National Unity Front, she unseated a male incumbent from the rival Mask Party and made tackling and corruption in her city a focal point. The city's got a million people. It's the second largest in Bolivia, the cornerstone of her work. Chapaton considers herself lucky that she was not in the municipal building on February 17th, 2016, when an arson attack killed 6 public officials. She believes she was targeted for her anti corruption work. Last October, after the disputed presidential election, Chapaton was again attacked because she says many people said that because of me, the mass lost support in El Alto. The mayor's office was burned, as was the home Chapaton's shares with her parents. She has relocated to a temporary office, and her scattered family had to move to several undisclosed locations. She scrolls through the phone, sharing the threats she received regularly on WhatsApp. Chapaton has to pay for her sins. One read, this bitch is doing all of this, and we have to take the mayor's office, most of the areas, to neutralize them. Another message says, we want her to quit. Chapaton has no plans to do so. At no time did I have a moment of doubt, she says. I knew that I was doing things well. All right. This article was by Rania Abu Said and Andrea Bruce was a photographer. I think that everybody needs to ask those questions, the important questions like, does the group we're supposed to represent you in government really represent you? Does it reflect the population of the people in the country, the experience of the people in the country? If not, it's going to be run like the United States is today. You need to have a better democracy. It was interesting that a nice picture of the changing the face of politics, and you can see these colors and greens and blues, reds, yellowish, maybe some gray. All right, those are different countries, and countries like Sweden, Finland, and Costa Rica are at the top of the list because they ensure basic political freedoms and civil liberties. That in each case, the 35% of the parliament members, on average, are women. The United States is not one of them. The United States is over here. It's a level 2 country, and it's kind of down in the list. So, and this map shows least democratic and most democratic. So, most democratic and least democratic over here. I'm not sure how this all works out. I think the visual is not too clear in some cases, but the fact that the United States is way down the list and even in the tier 2 category says the United States has a lot to do to empower women to be represented in government and actually have a good variety of experiences, background, not just for women, but for all people. I would suggest you go out and get involved in somebody's campaign, especially women's this year, and make sure that you change the system. We got to do it piece by piece, slowly but surely, but we can get this done. And we hope that women in the other countries that we've talked about today, Afghanistan, New Zealand, as well as indigenous groups and other minorities, are supported. especially in Afghanistan and Bolivia. All right, thank you for listening to my channel. Give us a thumbs up if you could. Um, and if you like this program, there's lots of other stories I'm sharing from on the porch at the Kevin Stoddard channel. All right, thank you for liking the page, and for uh, comments that you want to add later, feel free. And I hope you have a great day, and get out and get involved in making women and minority groups in society more empowered in the government, wherever you're at. God bless you.